Good morning, everyone. If you've grabbed your second cup of coffee and you're ready to go, we might begin. Only because this first panel has 4 presenters. So just let me introduce myself. I'm Stan Pugliese from the History Department here at Hofstra University. I do work on 20th century Italian fascism and anti-fascism, biographies on Carlo Rosselli, who was, one of the most influential anti-fascists of the 1920s and 30s. For those of you that don't know him, you might know Bernardo Bertolucci's film, The Conformist, based on Alberto Moravia's novel of the same name. Professor Quadri, who's assassinated by The Conformist, was based on Carlo Rosselli. I've also done a biography of Ignazio Siloni, a founding member of the Italian Communist Party, and, Bread and Wine, Fontamara. So I'm very pleased to be the moderator for this first panel. And I thank Marianne Trasciati and Fraser Ottanelli, dear friends and colleagues. Marianne was actually too modest. One thing that she did not mention about her own work is that she is the president of the Remember the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire Coalition Museum, which will open hopefully next year, correct, Marianne? Right? So that's also tied into her scholarly work and her activism. So we have 4 speakers this morning. They are not in the, we're not going to do them in the order that's in the program. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce them. I'll introduce them individually. They will present. At the end of the 4 presentations, we will then convene up on the stage for a conversation with the audience, okay? So the panelists have decided that Ali Jones is going to speak first, correct? No? Oh, no. Nils. Okay, so this was the original one. Okay, so Nils, Dr. Nils Schuhmacher is a lecturer and researcher of criminological social research at Hamburg University and a member of the German Institute for the Study of Protest and Social Movements. He has conducted research on contentious politics since 2005. His monograph, Nicht machen, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, is for sale in the back and offers a first empirical study of autonomous anti-fascism in Germany. Recent publications of his address the far right, youth subcultures, and political protest. And the title of his talk is Continental European Antifa, Why the 1990s Matter More Than You Might Think. So, Nils Schuhmacher.
Hello. So, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure. I'm the first presenter in the first panel, and as you heard, my talk has the title Continental European Antifa, How the 90s Matter More Than We Might Think. Firstly, I have to confess, my talk is limited mostly, in fact, to Germany. So it would be more precisely to say German Antifa, how the 90s matter, but in some parts I include the European situation. Second thing is, as you heard, I changed the word why into how, and the simple reason for that is if something matters always depends on your definition and on your argument. And here it is. Here's my argument. I'm going to read it because I feel a little bit safer with the language then, and here we go. I hope you can understand. Okay. Talking about anti-fascism in the 1990s at a conference on anti-fascism in the 21st century may need some explanation. As we all know, times are completely different, and so are the challenges. What is more, today's Antifa activists mostly know the 90s only from second or third-hand accounts. However, I argue that this decade, in fact, presents a critical turning point in Antifa practice that remains not only deeply relevant, but also visible in current debates. Today's strategies and concepts of anti-fascist activism can hardly be understood without looking at its roots, which Arlie Jones and I see as trajectories stretching between the 1990s and the present. The research project we are currently conducting investigates anti-fascist contentious politics of the 90s based on at least 150, 120 to 150 interviews, which is quite a lot for a qualitative research project, with former and current activists across Germany. As we are still in the fieldwork stage of this project, in the very early fieldwork stage, to be honest, this paper will present our initial hypotheses about why the 1990s are an important starting point for understand Antifa today. I proposed the following three theses. Firstly, the beginning of the 1990s witnessed the second fundamental break in the ideological history of anti-fascism. The first being the triumph of European fascisms and subsequent defeat of the left in the 1930s. The end of the Cold War in 1989-1990 opened a corridor of democratization, but also heralded a decade of new nationalism, racist violence, and the societal failure to deal with it. Continental Antifa today can be seen as a product of these developments. To outline these ideological breaks, for the period from World War II up to the end of the 1980s, we can speak with Dagmar Herzog of a post-fascist anti-fascism. The fascism she means here is the wartime fascism and failed resistance to it of the early to mid-20th century Germany, in the lineage many draw beginning with the 1920s. This anti-fascism is contrasted with the Cold War post-fascist anti-fascism that lasted until the 1980s. This post-fascist anti-fascism included the trials of former Nazi officials, the gradual transition of society away from Nazi structures and in reaction to them. More importantly, this new post-fascist anti-fascism drew strength from the tensions that arose in the conservative bourgeois mechanisms of coping with fascism and from an attitude that wanted to heal the wounds of Nazi fascist rule with silence, law, and order. This new anti-fascism was thus post-fascist in a double sense, both against historical fascism and the contemporary conservative mentality. However, I argue that this post-fascist anti-fascism also came to an end with the fall of the wall and the conclusion of the Cold War, in a critical turning point where anti-fascism moved from societal debates to the street politics of a political and cultural milieu that were deeply dissatisfied with societal progress or lack thereof. On the one hand, with the end of the Cold War, fascism became an object of history, with many arguing that anti-fascism was no longer relevant, in fact even helpless, since fascism was a thing of the past. On the other hand, the cultural and political conservatism of the post-war society was increasingly replaced by a politically diverse liberalism that claimed to have overcome the Nazi past by a new normality of acceptance, democracy, and tolerance. There was no longer any need for anti-fascism when liberalism had effectively solved the issue of fascism and history had come to a happy Hegelian ending, according to Fukuyama. However, this neat conclusion was immediately challenged, in Germany particularly, by the beginning of the 90s, when reality on the streets clashed jarringly with the tidy ideology presented by the state. As violent pogroms and attacks on migrants erupted, those activists recently accused of being helpless and irrelevant found themselves the first line of defense against neo-Nazi attacks on refugees, migrants, and people of color. Think, for example, of the arson attacks in Mölln, 1992, in Solingen, 1993, and the mass violence of Hoyerswerda, 1991, Rostock, 1992, and Mannheim in the same year. These events became fundamental touchstones for the new 90s Antifa, whose political and moral identities are rooted in these experiences. The liberal democracy promised by the new post-Cold War state did not seem capable of contesting these new murderous street neo-fascists and racists whose everyday baseball bat-wielding street thuggery opened a new chapter in neo-Nazism as tyranny from below. For this reason, our research agenda analyzes Antifa from below, which emerged as an everyday culture's defense of vulnerable people and of themselves, rather than an ideological project of the wider left rooted in broader ideological structures like Marxism, communism, and so on. It is this type of anti-fascism from below, the product of the street fights during the decade of the boneheads of the 1990s, that we find predominantly categorizing German Antifa today, rather than the wartime resistance of the Nazi government or the criminal and societal trials of former Nazi officers in the 1960s. Secondly, in the course of the 90s, a double development of cultural institutionalization, this is a real challenging word, and the making of a pop cultural phenomenon was set in motion, which paradoxically produced a political weakening of critical, or one might say radical, anti-fascism. The history of the 90s is a history of the cultural institutionalization of this new form of anti-fascism, which opposed the street violence of the neo-Nazis on the expanding far right. By institutionalization, I mean the slow infiltration of official debates and finally finding a way into the structures of civil society and its emerging activities against this new far right. This is not to claim that anti-fascism was institutionalized into government or law, but rather that cultural and societal forms emerged to solidify anti-fascist politics. For example, large independent archives, such as APA-BITS in Berlin, were created to document and monitor the actions of the far right and to lend discursive legitimacy to this narrative. Similarly, many of the magazines and newspapers that still exist today, such as Antifa Infoblatt, can also be traced to this period. Via these cultural institutions, Antifa in the 90s forced difficult discussions that society did not wish to acknowledge. At least in Germany, this agenda setting contributed to the emergence of state-funded programs against right-wing extremism at the end of the 90s. These programs expressed the growing change in public opinion and a new awareness of the problem. What is more, for the first time, the perspectives of those affected by racist and right-wing violence were also being taken into account. But Antifa groups of the 90s have not only contributed to this change, some also became part of it by turning their commitment into a profession. This is the framework by which their critique from below necessarily transformed into critical participation. Antifa, therefore, changed not only civil society, but also itself. However, the flip side of this process of integration, like at the end of the post-fascist anti-fascism Herzog discusses, is that many Antifa groups no longer saw the need for the street politics against the far right. The remaining few found it increasingly difficult to exist alongside state-recognized forms of anti-right-wing commitment, laden as they were with surveillance and political ideology that activists had long since learned not to trust. For example, being funded by the same state who wielded considerable repression against even the more peaceful parts of the left. This societal institutionalization accompanied what can be called a history of pop culturalization. While at times these processes ran in parallel, at other points they diverged widely. To offer two examples as illustration. In the 1990s, there was a move away from the narrow conception of radical subculture, in singular or plural, radical subcultures, namely punk and hardcore music and clothing styles, and towards pop culture. This was accompanied by a crisis of identity in the radical left as debates over an apolitical counter-culture were fueled by identity politics, which manifested in clothing styles again that could be purchased from a politically resistant catalog. As Antifa opened up a wider cultural milieu, many considered the scene to be watered down to accommodate the new, less political members. Secondly, media strategies of self-presentation increasingly came into play, relying on elements of pop culture again. The term pop Antifa, which is from a Berlin Antifa group from the late 90s, coined at the end of the 1990s, sums up this development. In this way, Antifa, in contrast to its institutionalized version, could become a filler for a politics that serves all kind of purposes. The invention of the brand Antifa, in fact, watered down the profile of anti-fascist politics. However, in becoming open to anything in a broad pop culture way, Antifa also risked losing its critical stance and radical content. An Antifa that includes everything struggles to reject anything, including the forces of oppression, racism, and xenophobia that continue to affect vulnerable people. Thirdly, these processes have generated specific forms of resilience that may create new starting points for anti-fascist strategies today. I have said that institutionalization and pop culturalization have led to a weakening of contentious forms of Antifa. But the situation is not only dark and dire. It is also true that they have laid a foundation for political and cultural resilience and created new possibilities of resistance across culture and society, especially in Germany. This can be witnessed in various contemporary manifestations: the increased sensitivity to racism in contemporary society, a new societal openness to acknowledging formerly taboo issues, wider circles engaged in contesting the far right, as well as increased awareness of the effects of racism and xenophobia. One of the goals of our research project will be to investigate the influence of 90s political acculturation upon professionals and civil servants and members of civil society in any which way, who bring the unique subjectivity with them to their careers. Careers means their moral careers, thinking of government, and also their social careers. In fact, the subjectivities of what are now well-established citizens can be traced to this period. And there is a scholarly and also political need to elaborate and examine the impact of a generation of young people whose political identities were formed in light of the racist attacks on migrants, left-wing alternative youth, and the urgent need to take action themselves to stop it. I hypothesize size that interviews will continue to demonstrate a clear and direct trajectory from this period to the contemporary reality of Germany, where NSU neo-Nazis are actually facing criminal trial in contrast to the lack of police engagement with the murderous pogroms of the early 90s, for example. These political subjectivities have marched through the cultural institutions. And this is how the 90s matter more than we might think. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nils. And thank you for sticking to the time frame. So our second speaker is Dr. Ali Jones, who is an assistant professor of politics at the Center for Trust, Peace, and Social Relations in Coventry. Her history of the autonomous squatting movements in Hamburg is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. Currently, she's writing the history of German Antifa since reunification with Nils Schuhmacher. Ali.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Let me just get the PowerPoint open. Uh-oh. The folder, November 2nd? Good now. Whoa. Fantastic. Cool. If I do view. Yeah, I just want the presenter view where it tells me what's happening but doesn't tell you what's happening. Nope, no luck. Okay, cool. Okay, great. Thank you so much to the organizers for this fantastic event. I'm really, really grateful to be here. So the 1977 German autumn brought the question of left-wing armed struggle and terrorism to the forefront of European political conversation. This climaxed in the kidnapping of Hans-Martin Schleyer, the former SS officer and now president of the Confederation of German Employers Association and the Federation of German Industries, two quite high-profile positions. He was kidnapped by members of the Red Army faction. Despite these kidnappers' demands, that German autumn crisis concluded not with the release of their imprisoned leadership in exchange for Schleyer, but rather the death of 3 of those imprisoned, which was in turn met by the murder of Schleyer on 18th October 1977. So I mentioned this case of historical terrorism in the context of Antifa Ost in order to identify a crucial U-turn in left radical practice after 1977, which was kick-started then a few months later by the West Berlin Tunix Congress in January 1978. After this pushback and this U-turn, Militanz became sharply distinguished from mere political violence, a concept that has now become fundamental to the German radical left after 1977, when the reaction to the RAF's murderous actions led to a massive pushback. Although a legitimate form of political struggle, militant violence, as opposed to mere violence, cannot be used within this tradition for its own sake. Rather, it's quite strictly regulated and must only be applied against, quote, the ideology responsible for Auschwitz, no more and no less, which is a quote from the Interim. In practice, Interim, being an Antifa, long-standing Antifa publication. So in practice, this means that countering Nazi fascism and neo-Nazism and neo-fascism, goes on, can happen by whatever means necessary, up to and including the use of violence, but that violence must be limited very, very specifically against specific targets, and only when connected to an explicit moralized justification. So I offer 2 citations here, the first from Interim and the second being my definition that I put together after conducting at that time 42 interviews with Antifa Autonom across Germany active since the 1980s. All of them limited militant violence to a moral justification and a moral application that had to be very, very strictly thought about and debated within this tradition. A few of the quotes from some of the interviews. all the names are changed, obviously. You know, Alfred specified quite stridently, this has nothing to do with violence, this is totally different. Claude says, you know, we use Militanz, the others use violence. It's different. Andreas said, Militanz can be violent, but it's associated with this claim to moral righteousness. And this is the historical trajectory that I want to investigate in this paper. So, while many in the post-RAF radical left, such as the Antifa autonomists, the autonomists, would complete this definition by limiting its application to, quote, never people, only objects, the Antifa autonomists might generally include neo-fascists in the latter category, so long as that violence was not lethal, which is really a crucial difference. So, what's my next one? Nope, okay. In contrast, fascist, Nazi, and neo-Nazi violence, especially in Germany, is generally intended to kill minorities. It's generally intended to be lethal. Whether these minorities be Jews during the Second World War or other people who were oppressed, migrants and refugees in the series of pogroms and murderous attacks and arson attacks throughout the early 90s that Nils talked about, or the 9 people of a migrant background murdered by the NSU neo-Nazi terrorist cell in the 2000s. These are 3 of the leaders of that cell, and the dots show you where 9 of those murders of people of color and people of a migrant background happened, these being the people who have been murdered. This paper, which is presented here in much shortened form, so forgive me, seeks to apply this specific understanding of Militanz as a strictly limited political tool, as opposed to mere violence, of course, and to apply this historical trajectory to a recent case study in the Leipzig Antifa Ost group. This paper reads this form of Militanz as a political act and tactic, which defines, justifies, and understands itself very specifically as political, within a radical countercultural trajectory stretching back to the radical left's backlash to 1977. So using this self-understanding put forth by Antifa themselves, because it would be totally unethical for me to impose something upon them, so I'm using that they've put forward, the paper interrogates the recent alleged actions in Leipzig, the role, or maybe even the absence, of discursive infrastructures for this radical counter-public, and what this means then for the question of political communication in the case of Antifa Ost. I have pictures of pogroms. So on 5th of November 2020, the alleged Antifa activist Lina E. was taken from her Leipzig flat under heavy police guard, transported via commando helicopter to the Federal Prosecutor's Office, and charged under Section 129 with forming a criminal organization, in which she's accused of taking part in several violent attacks against neo-Nazis between 2018 and 2020. Now, it's important to note, and somewhat counterintuitive, that 129 is different than 129A. So 129 is generally used only for investigative purposes. It provides police with legal options to X-ray dissenting communities, but to date it has almost never resulted in convictions or even court cases. In contrast, 129A, which is a different clause in the legal code, is charged as one with membership in a terrorist organization. Now that's usually what's used when charging radical left-wing political cases in the courts. Now surprisingly, the usual means of charging 129A accused terrorists in the radical left tend to actually be much lighter and much gentler in terms of court time. Whereas under 129, criminal organization, Lina and 4 of her alleged compatriots are being prosecuted under the full force of the law. The prosecutor for the case is usually reserved for cases of severe state endangerment. Think Osama bin Laden. That's the kind of prosecutor this 25-year-old is facing. So this legislation is usually reserved for state endangering cases, and she faces untold years of prison time if convicted. She also remains in prison 2 years later, and is presented quite sensationally, really, by the state and by media as the illicit kingpin of an elite squad of Antifa militants terrorizing political opponents for years. They also point out that she wears a miniskirt. That's apparently extremely important, I'm told. So one must also initially note the spatial infrastructures at play in Leipzig-Connewitz. And so Leipzig-Connewitz is a left-wing neighborhood, sort of an enclave. that's seen as a political and cultural safe space, like a Taz, a little left-wing bubble in the highly conservative city of Leipzig. So the current alleged attacks seem to have taken place in response to a riot 2 years earlier in January 2016, when 250 neo-Nazis left the anti-migration Legede, which is the Leipzig branch of Pegida, rally, to set fire to cars, light a building on fire, set off explosives, vandalize shops, and assault residents and passers-by. This is an image from the rally of Legede, which they then left to start a riot in Chemnitz. The state response was mild. These is 120 men who took part in this riot. Their details were recorded, but none of them faced prison time. A few faced suspended sentences. This was then responded to, allegedly, in October 2019, when 10 to 15 accused Antifa activists attacked a well-known neo-Nazi pub in Eisenach, and then again 2 months later when the pub's owner, himself now in prison on the basis of 129, and who was the head of the local branch of an extreme right-wing political party, was beaten with batons. So these back and forths can be read as a cycle of revenge for that 2016 defilement of the Chemnitz safe space, and a way of the Antifa bringing their fight to enemy turf. It is also clear to us, but maybe not to the state, which I'm going to get to, that these targets, mainly these men, who had lit off explosives and randomly assaulted citizens in Chemnitz, would understand the revenge motive for what was going on. So, while these altercations illuminate the spatial symbolic structures of political and cultural scene safe zones, and the need to defend them, what they apparently lack, and what I'm trying to point out, is that they lack the discursive infrastructures that usually accompany traditional left radical politics. Now, traditionally, the German radical left operates within what might be seen as a non-bourgeois public sphere, what Nancy Fraser or Uwe Majeski would call a radical counterpublic. So this Antifa counterpublic stretches back to the 1980s, building on the intellectual and political heritage of the autonomous scene and throughout the Antifa of the 1990s, of course. So this discursive non-bourgeois, we're not talking Habermas here, sphere, includes a network of both scenes and social movements, which are united and kept cohesive by discursive infrastructures, forms of communication, such as, for example, the archives Nils mentioned, or newspapers and magazines in which Antifa could discuss and debate and limit their actions in conversation with their political culture. For example, Antifa Infoblatt or Radical, magazines such as Clash, Zeck in Hamburg, Infobug, Bug Info, and Interim are major Antifa autonomous magazines. There's also left radical magazines more generally, Jungle World, Junge Welt, maybe even Taz a little bit still. The Tageszeitung, the daily newspaper, it's a left-wing newspaper in Germany. They provide these discursive counterpublics for the broader debates and discussion that constitute the Antifa life world, Habermas might say. For example, in the Antifa Autonom magazine Interim, scholar Sebastian Hauns counts at least 350 articles addressing the use and application of Militanz between 1988 and 2001. And this suggests the veracity of this discursive community throughout that whole time period. Within these scenes, such radical counterpublics would also generally be oriented around a physical political infrastructure, such as a plenary body or in a squatted house, or another space where these actions could be discussed, debated, and limited in their scope to ensure that they adhere to that standard of militancy that these activists use to set themselves apart from violence. Crucially, most actions would also be accompanied by a statement, claiming responsibility and explaining the rationale behind it. Antifa groups around the country still make use, for example, of indie media to release statements, and groups in Leipzig have similarly used indie media to claim responsibility for attacks on gentrification sites, etc. Any use of violence is thus hotly discussed and limited, and also justified, whether that be through newspapers, plenary bodies, or congresses. And this allows that militant action to claim the moral justification used in this radical counterpublic. And so when Nils and I sat down to figure out what on earth was going on in Leipzig, the thing we kept coming back to was in this Antifa Ost case, this discursive space of communication and self-regulation appears to have fallen away. There doesn't appear to be any clear infrastructure for scene communication. And in fact, the Antifa movement in Leipzig appears to be uncoordinated groups of actors who not only do not discuss their actions, but most of whom claim they've never even heard of Lena, who's apparently their illicit kingpin. So this loss of a discursive counterpublic leaves only the ghost of a former scene, once rich in infrastructures of discussion, but now lacking in that political engagement that justifies militancy. So in short, this invocation of Militanz as moral superiority relies upon that historical and political trajectory rooted in the limitations reinforced by this radical counterpublic. And without these discursive structures firmly established after 1977, the Militanz and the superiority that they claim seems to be a vaguely implied ghost of what was a former politics. This loss of discursive space in infrastructures suggests that Schweigen, or remaining silent, which is the title of this article in Interim, has come to replace communication out of the assumption of moral superiority, to the degree that one believes a rationale is perhaps no longer needed. This 2001-2002 debate in Interim speculates as such, arguing that either activists are too busy planning actions, or, as is more likely, they simply assume their own superiority. Now, it might be easy, when speaking to the choir, to assume that the act of punching a Nazi to save a migrant doesn't need a rationale. But this invocation of physical violence is based upon the assumption of the political justification that accompanies it and justifies it. And when that political aspect is silenced, the justification then seems to fade away. So, furthermore, while preventing neo-Nazis from committing acts of white supremacy, xenophobia, or racism is undoubtedly a moral good, it is unclear how the alleged attacks by Antifa Ost fulfilled those aims when robbed of that political context. So, according to state prosecutors, who are charging Lena as a criminal, not as a political terrorist, attacks on an individual on his way to football, or attacks on the owner of a pub, which is what they see, are not necessarily political acts, without those discursive infrastructures connecting those acts to political and moral aims. For example, that the targeted individuals are well-known violent neo-Nazis accused and not charged because of state complicity with attacking passers-by, blowing buildings up, attacking migrants, etc. And at the risk of putting words into their mouths, it would not be difficult to make this case. Absolutely not. This is not a difficult thing to do, particularly in regards to the alleged attack on the pub owner in 2019. So, Leon Ringel is the leader of a well-known neo-Nazi political party. He also runs, along with his mother, the pub that was attacked. Now, although the state sees him as an innocent civilian who was then beaten, you can see him here in front of the Nazi flag. That's Leon Ringel. And some of the many charges against him include being the central figure of the Eisenach Nazi scene, being a card-carrying supporter of the British group National Action, who are paraded under the slogan #HitlerWasRight. They were banned in 2016 after publicly celebrating the murder of UK MP Joe Cox by a white supremacist. Ringel is a member of the now-banned National Assembly Eisenach, a neo-Nazi cell, which, when it was banned, reformed to make the Knockout 15 martial arts club, because you can't ban a sports club, and this is obviously just about sports. On the neo-Nazi web platform Iron March, Ringel introduced himself in writing by expressing his desire to deport all Jews to an island, that he believed that the Holocaust was better than freedom, that Germany was his religion, and Hitler was, quote, his prophet. A leak from this website has also revealed his support and possible membership in the terrorist group Atomwaffen Division, or the National Socialist Order since 2020, an international far-right terrorist network responsible for at least 5 murders and hate crimes across the USA. Ringel is also a member of the German division of Atomwaffen and helped create promotional videos for that cell. So any of these various factors would have made it extremely easy, I think, to explain the Antifa motivation for the alleged actions against Ringel and his pub, against beating an innocent civilian on his way to football practice, or going into a pub and conducting minor injuries upon 3 people. However, what is striking in this case is the absence of any similar explanation in 2019 in any of this former discursive infrastructure that once was the rich political culture of the Antifa movement. While simple violence against a pub owner cannot be justified on its own, a militant action against a leading violent neo-Nazi in Saxony in order to prevent further violent attacks would have been much easier to understand politically and would likely have been seen as a mitigating factor in the trial. Now, this is not to say that violence is encouraged or acceptable. Rather, it is to argue that when one is claiming the trajectory and the righteousness of Militanz coming from this tradition and coming from the moral tradition of stopping Nazis, that militancy can only exist as part of that discursive infrastructure. And that discursive infrastructure must be communicated either to the public sphere, within the radical counterpublic of autonomous discursive life worlds, or ideally both. Otherwise, these militant actions, no matter how much we may agree with what they're trying to do, become merely the ghosts of a once righteous past, and now degraded in the state prosecution's eye to mere criminal violence. And those accused are being prosecuted accordingly, not as political radicals, but as mere violent criminals under Section 129.
Before I introduce the next speaker, could I ask the people in the back if the sound is okay? I mean, I know the acoustics in this room are not great. It's okay. Otherwise, I was going to ask the speakers to speak more into the microphone. Okay, very good. So our third speaker is Kristin Janica, who is a social scientist and a researcher on the far right in civil society with a focus on East Germany. She's the co-editor of, and I'll give the title, 30 Jaar Antifa in Ostdeutschland, which I translate as 30 Years of Antifa in East Germany, published in the 5th edition just now in the autumn of 2022. Currently, she's a doctoral candidate at the Center for Civil Society Research at WZB Berlin Social Science Center. And she's also involved in APABIS, which I already mentioned this morning, the Anti-Fascist Press Hive and Education Center in Berlin. And the title of her talk is The Invisible Antifa Ost, the Rediscovery of an East German Anti-Fascist Movement.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you have to tell me if you can see the presentation. I can't. Okay, so you can see the presentation, right? So I have to look. Okay, it looks good. Maybe I have to put it on the full screen. Okay, so thank you so much. I'm very happy to speak about a special case, the East German anti-fascist movement. And I'm going to make a quick turn into the year 2021. A year ago, in November 2021, anti-fascist activists came together at Berlin's Zionskirche, a church in East Berlin, to discuss the topic of right-wing hegemony and anti-fascist engagement in East Germany. The title, What Do We Do Now? Only Chasm and Not a Bit of Hope in the East, suggests that the anti-fascist movement is on the defensive. Current debates about the electoral successes of the relatively new far-right party Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, is the background to this. However, the choice for the Zionskirche wasn't done, as a venue was not done coincidental. It commemorates the attack by neo-Nazis on concert-goers in 1987, which can be understood at the birth of the Antifa at the German Democratic Republic, the GDR. I'm a bit too big. So you may be wondering why they are talking about East Germany and not Germany in general. So it has been 33 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and the GDR doesn't exist anymore. But so even today, the distinction between East and West Germany is relevant for the German society as well as for the anti-fascist movement. But little research is done regarding the anti-fascist movement in East Germany, the former GDR. Over the past few years, gradually publication, mostly by activists themselves, about left-wing and anti-fascist movement in Germany emerged. However, Germany only meant West Germany. In these publications, little attention was paid to the formation of an independent movement during the last years of the GDR. The characteristics of the East German movement appeared in previous publication only marginally. But there are so many details to be told. Whether it was the anti-fascists distinguished themselves from an anti-fascist doctrine of the GDR, or the physical threats of neo-Nazis which were omnipresent and for many a key event for their politicization. But also in scientific research, there is little about the East German perspective. Interdisciplinary approaches, often as a link between social movement and academia, try to fill the research gap. The 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 2019 gave the topic a further boost. Those affected were recounting their experiences with right-wing violence and racist violence, as well as their resistance against the far right in the GDR and the 1990s in published autofictional books and under the hashtag Baseballschlägerjahre, which Nils already told about. Baseball bad years, you can say in English, and it's a symbol for neo-Nazi violence. So for some years now, there has been a debate in the East German parts of an anti-fascist movement about an independent East German development. In this presentation, I want to discuss why and how today's activists relate to an East German anti-fascist movement more than 30 years after the end of the GDR. My thesis is that this self-understanding within the movement is a reaction to the growing far right in East Germany and the return of a discourse about the so-called Brown East. Through this discourse, anti-fascist engagement becomes invisible. The rediscovery of the history of an East German movement is to be understood as a strategy to make anti-fascism visible. So with the content and discursive analysis, I'm going to take a closer look at the event at the Zionskirche, what was said and what was referred to, and how what was said can be understood regarding a bigger discourse, a larger discourse around the far right and anti-fascist resistance in East Germany. In my point of view, the evening can be seen as a get-together of activists, which represents the self-understanding within the anti-fascist movement in East Germany. So I'm not going to take a look to the movement's past, so instead I'm looking at current discourses about the so-called Brown East and the anti-fascist debate about an East German characteristic. And to get to the bottom of this, I want to highlight a time when the history of the anti-fascist movement was rediscovered and show examples that make the activism more visible. So the discussion event at the Zionskirche had taken up the topic that has been discussed. You can see this. Discussed extensively in the media and reveals an imbalance when it comes to looking at Eastern Germany. The focus is on the far right and right-wing violence. Thus, the image of a Brown East is repeatedly created. So the term brown refers to National Socialist history, I think everyone knows. Various socialist scientists have pointed out this discourse. The discursive asymmetry between East and West Germany can be explained by an othering and a devaluation of East Germany, which Kathleen Heft calls ossification. East Germany and the East Germans appear as a deviation from an unmarked West German norm. The narratives of Brauner Osten, Sonderfall Ost, Angstzone Ost are therefore the counterpart of an assumed plural and democratic West German society and are inadequate to analyze the phenomenon. The discourse has returned at a time when not only right-wing violence and racist street mobilization against refugees increased. Furthermore, despite several personal changes, the 2013 founded AfD had managed to enter parliament in every election since 2014. The so-called refugee crisis that began in the fall of 2015 is considered decisive for its nationwide success. In this context, the discourse of the Brown East appears again and again. Underlying the Brown East discourse are statistical and material realities that find expression in electoral successes of the far right, approval of right-wing attitudes, demonstrations, and campaigns against refugees and acts of violence against marginalized people. But if you look over a longer period, or if you take social demographic into account, you don't find a specific, so neither the statistic or the historical development of the far right paint a clear picture. But I really don't want to discuss if there's a bigger problem of right-wing extremism in the East or in the West. I assume there is a specific, because the right-wing extremism developed differently there, and the commitment to combating it also developed under different conditions. But what I want to point out is that it leads to a negation of anti-fascist engagement and renders it invisible. So to counter this, not just the attribution of the Brown East, but also, but above all, the reality of right-wing violence and the success of the far right, the panel discussion at the Zionskirche addressed what I would call a rediscovery of a movement's history, as well as of current political practice in East Germany. So I'm going to quote a part of the announcement text of the panel discussion in the Berlin Zionskirche. It says, in search for ways out of the disaster, it is worth taking a closer look. In the East, too, left-wing and anti-fascist groups had and still have their local successes, slowly becoming more visible and louder. Actors from then and now are speaking out with their view on the past and the present. So to pick up on the quote, let us have a look at the movement's past, which takes us back to November 1987. 35 years have passed since the founding of the first anti-fascist group in the GDR. On the night of November 5th to 6th, 1987, anti-fascists put up leaflets with a slogan warning neo-Nazis also in GDR, in downtown Potsdam, which is near Berlin. The activists wanted to draw attention to racism and neo-Nazism as problems in the GDR. The reason for the action was the attack by neo-Nazis on a concert in Berlin's Zionskirche, I already mentioned that, 2 weeks before that, on October 17th of 1987. While Nazi activities had been played down previously and not taken seriously, the GDR authorities now had to deal with the problem. Within the alternative left, especially punk scene, it led to a debate about self-defense. The demand for public awareness of neo-Nazis and racism became louder and louder. As a result, the first Antifa groups were founded in Potsdam, East Berlin, and other cities in the GDR like Halle, Dresden, or Guben. So if you look further, Nils had spoken about this, the anti-fascist engagement in the 1990s and early 2000s was always a necessity. However, over the decades, the movement changed and the little knowledge was passed on, so the knowledge of past events and struggles was lost. So you can say one strategy of becoming visible is looking at the past, and the other one is to empower current activism. So the aim of the discussion was also to talk about best practice examples and motivating practices of engagement in East Germany today. For people participated in this panel discussion with different perspectives, of age, gender, and race, and they all came from different parts of the former GDR. Based on this, I would like to briefly show examples of anti-fascist initiatives that want to make anti-fascist work in East Germany visible. As a best practice example referred to, I would like to introduce you to the Polylux network. Polylux is funding projects in East Germany, and on their website they explain why they're focusing on East Germany. So just a quote. We focus on East because we come from the East, or we came from the East. Live here or moved here, and we know there is the other East beyond the sometimes one-sided portrait as AfD positive. We also know that the AfD, with its right-wing positions and inhuman attitudes and views, is an all-German problem. We are starting to back committed people on uncomfortable projects in the East. So, and other examples that were mentioned included a conference in 2017 under the title 30 Years of Antifa in East Germany, which was a result of the huge interest in the book of the same title. Two other participants talked about their activism at the FAU Plauen, an anarchist and syndicalist union in Saxony, which focuses on supporting people in labor conflicts and grassroots youth and education work. Also mentioned was the Soli Antifa Ost trial. We already heard about this from Ali Jones. There's also the journal Telegraph with its origins in the GDR, and a new journal called Ostjournal with a focus on East Germany and Eastern Europe. So as a result of my analysis of how and why today's activists relate to an East German Antifa movement, I would like to highlight the following 5 points. They emphasize growing up in the GDR and East Germany. So socialization or even identity is important to them. Mostly this includes the experience of violence and right-wing hegemony, especially in the early 1990s. To overcome being a victim of right-wing violence, anti-fascist activists organized themselves and learned self-defense. A key point is the feeling of marginalization because of a lack of civil society and spaces for youth culture. The political scientist Nils Schuhmacher has called it an anti-hegemonic type of anti-fascist engagement. It refers to a commitment that involves risk and may entail danger for one's own life and safety. So given that I've talked a lot about the Brown East and the othering of East Germans, you might understand the point regarding the experience of devaluation as an effect on the activists. So to embrace the otherness made them feel empowered. Relating to an East German movement could also be seen as an intervention against the Brown East West German discursive hegemony. In summary, the question of an East German movement can be answered with a view to its rediscovery. The biographical experiences of the activists in the GDR or afterwards with neo-Nazis and right-wing hegemony are relevant, and historical references such as the attack on the Zionskirche in 1987 are significant. Making past and present visible can be seen as an empowerment strategy to develop agency, strengthen civil society, and push back right-wing hegemony. The search for an own history and own characteristics can be placed in a larger discourse around East Germany, which also includes question of representation in politics, economics, media, includes fair payment, pensions, gender equality, and so on. So right-wing violence and the counter-resistance only a small part of this discourse. From a research perspective, it's difficult to speak of an independent East German movement today. There are more exchanges and overarching mobilizations. In addition, it is difficult to separate the anti-fascist movement from other civil society structures, especially in rural areas. Activists are often in various associations, clubs, initiatives, and even parties. Likewise, many established NGOs in the field of democracy counseling and prevention have emerged from anti-fascist structures. But this does not apply to every civil society organization in this field. However, it should have become clear from my presentation that there are specifics in East German context, and these, as well as the question of an East German identity, are important for the anti-fascist activist. So thank you so much, and if you're interested in reading more about the topic, you can get my book about the East German movement. I have 2 copies with me. Unfortunately, it's in German, but I don't know if somebody wants to translate it into English. Okay, so thank you.
The fact that the book is in the 5th edition is telling, I think. So thank you, Christine. Our 4th speaker is Grzegorz Piotrowski, who is a sociologist and a cultural anthropologist who has been researching social movements since 2011, a graduate of the European University Institute in Florence. He is the author of several edited books and volumes and over a dozen scientific articles on social activism in Poland and Central Europe. He's currently assistant professor at the Institute of Sociology of the University of Gdansk. He's a senior researcher at the European Solidarity Center and vice president of the NGO, the Zatoka Foundation. And the title of his talk this morning is Anti-Fascism in Illiberal Democracy and East European Perspective.
Hi, thank you very much. I'll try to start my PowerPoint. Thank you very much for putting this conference together. It's a really rare opportunity to have a whole conference devoted to anti-fascism. This is a picture of my co-author. I did it on purpose because we spent holidays together, and he was trying to cut some hedges with a chainsaw in a T-shirt he got from his brother that says "Jesus lives." And this is a small trick we play on each other. But he's an important figure for this paper, for this presentation, because he conducted a research project when they surveyed street protests in Poland. And one of the street protests where I helped him to distribute the surveys, etc., was Anti-Fascist Street Party. It was almost exactly 1 year ago. In roughly 8 days' time, there's going to be another edition. So it's an annual thing on November 11th, which is the day of the Polish Independence Day, which, and I will talk more about it later, was taken over by the far right, by the really far right, in around 2009. But since 2011, it's one of the biggest street protests in Poland, with a population ranging up to 80,000 people. The Independent, the newspaper, call it the biggest far-right demonstration in the world, which is not exactly true. I mean, it is one of the biggest demonstrations, but I would. Many of the people are not self-identifying themselves as far-right, but I'll get to that. The thing is that we handed out surveys at this protest. Unfortunately, because of problems with coding, we only have access now to the responses that were submitted online. So we have roughly around 240 surveys completed, but there are a few hundred more coming in that were sent in on paper. And the other source of data for this presentation is my involvement in a 4-year project on anti-racist initiatives around the Baltic Sea region that was conducted at Södertörn University in Sweden. So I will also start with a historical, brief historical part. That where does the neo-fascist and anti-fascist came from? I won't be talking about pre-war history because that's another topic, and it has it doesn't have many connections to contemporary anti-fascism. But what was happening in the mid-1980s actually has a big, still quite a big influence. So around mid-1980s, there's an emergence of neo-Nazi groups in Poland, mostly skinheads. And there are some sources and testimonies claiming that that was done under the auspices of the secret police. that didn't know how to handle youth groups, didn't know how to handle especially left-leaning youth groups or punk youth groups. So they used this emerging far-right scene or skinhead scene just to divide and conquer youth activism in Poland. And in one of the cities, Wrocław, for instance, in 1989, one scholar calculated there was around 600 neo-Nazi skinheads. So that was a kind of a problem. And there were several even music festivals like Rubrege that had to be cancelled because of the neo-Nazi violence. And of course, if you have neo-Nazi violence, you will have a response. So there were networks that emerged. They were created ad hoc and very grassroots with radical anti-fascist action, the anti-Nazi group, and the anti-Nazi movement. Appeared independently in various cities without any form of coordination. But this is a period that is marked by high level of violence. And this poster you see, that was actually one of the first anti-fascist clashes that became publicly known. That was in Solidarność Anti-Apartheid. It was just after by the end of 1989. It was a concert organized to support anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa. It was organized by the Solidarność trade union, but it was attacked by neo-Nazis. And there are some pictures from that when you see prominent figures of the Solidarność movement getting in fistfights with neo-Nazis trying to attack. But as happened with other concerts, that also was interrupted. It had to be, and was cancelled basically. Okay, and what was also interesting is that with the development of the neo-Nazi scene, there were three main currents. There was the neo-pagan, it was the straightforward neo-Nazi, and ultra-nationalist that actually made a lot of references to the pre-war Polish far-right scene, like national democracy, it was called, etc. But around the year 2000, the far right started to institutionalize. So a lot of the activists from skinhead scene, etc., started wearing suits basically and entered mainstream politics. Around 2005, 2007, we had a coalition government with one of the parties, the League of Polish Families, being quite to a large extent populated by the former skinheads, former neo-Nazis. But this reduced the amount of violence. Obviously. So the anti-fascist and anti-racist activities switched to more NGO-based actions. And at the same time, two of the currents I mentioned, so the neo-Nazis, like straightforward neo-Nazi and neo-pagan, were quite, to a large extent, marginalized. I was talking recently to a colleague of mine who's doing studies on the far right. He said that there are around 150 straightforward neo-Nazis in Poland and maybe 200 neo-pagan far-right activists in Poland. But with the third current, the ultra-nationalist, that remained quite active, and I will get back to that soon. Because in 2015 in Poland, because I will, for the purpose of this talk, I will focus mostly on Poland. What happened? We had elections where the far right or the right-wing conservative Law and Justice Party won the elections, and actually there was the time 2015, 2019 when there was no left party in the parliament. So we had like right, far right, conservative right, etc. only. But a lot of these politicians made references to this ultra-nationalist current. They were really open about coming back to the pre-war times, this kind of retro-topic approach of coming back to this Polish nationalism, very closely connected to Catholic religion, which also almost became kind of an official religion in Poland. And what happened was in 2015, during the elections, the right-wing parties played intensively the card of migrant threat. It was the time of the migrant crisis, so-called, and the concepts of EU relocation program for refugees and migrants. And that was heavily attacked. And with having majority, and later also in 2015, the Law and Justice managed to put their person as a president. Andrzej Duda won the elections as well, so they actually controlled both chambers of the parliament and the presidential office. And with that, they started also controlling media. And on this more bluish picture, you see there's a screenshot, I admit not the best one, but I had to act quickly, of an educational program on public TV. When we had lockdown, they tried to substitute online teaching by broadcasting educational programs on TV. When they say, when the topic was the colonialism, and you had pros and cons of colonial politics. And actually, the pros of colonial politics was to introduce a European cultural and scientific heritage, introduce social norms that were of European descent, and, for instance, reducing some local traditions like cannibalism. So this is the state of of public discussion in Poland for the last 7 years actually, right? So and this is and the second picture is a picture from a counter demonstration in Białystok. Was a counter demonstration against the Pride Parade, which was organized in Białystok for the first time in 2019. And interestingly, there were 2 people caught from the counter-protesters' side, because it ended up with a clash. 2 people caught with a couple with an improvised explosive device. But because the prosecutors' offices in Poland are now under political control, they actually were let free. And they still were not even put on trial, although they had a clear intention of detonating that bomb at this Pride Parade. So this is the context of illiberal politics, of liberal democracy in Poland, and actually also in other Central European countries. And these illiberal democratic politics, they result in changes in political and discursive opportunity structures. If anyone had an NGO dealing even loosely with migrants, refugees, etc., it would be stripped of funding. And actually, state funding was around 2/3 of funding of NGO sector in Poland. There was withdrawals of pro-equality programs. There was a case of a textbook for policemen, how to spot a right-wing radical. It was withdrawn. As I already shown, there was a mainstreaming of hate speech. Like, for instance, my theoretically boss, the Minister for Education and Science, said that when there was a discussion about LGBT plus community, he said, like, we should stop with that. He said bullshit about equal rights. These people are not normal, and we should. And this is the end of story. And he said it on public TV. So this is like really mainstreaming hate speech. But also, there's I mentioned the control of the judicial system. And also, there is a case of right-wing groups being funded by the state. And you could see that 2 years ago during big street protests we had around changes in the abortion law, when there was a call for protecting the churches. And suddenly all the far-right groups, skinheads, etc., were mixed with police lines surrounding churches. So this is the political reality of Poland. But at the same time, trying to be maybe desperately optimistic, there's a wave of new social activism. If you look at the number of registered protest events in Poland, it has tripled between 2014 and 2016, and it still remains quite high. Of course, with the peak being behind us, but still, we have more street protests than we had in 2014. There is a growing intersectionality of protest campaigns, mainly because it's a new generation of activists, people that are in their early 20s right now, like people I teach at the university. They go into labor union activism. They are very much into, for instance, feminist activism, especially after the 2020 campaign. There was a poll done by one of the polling agencies in Poland that showed that whereas you had the level of engagement of people between the age of 18 and 24, usually around 6% of the population declared that they took part in a street protest in the previous year. In 2021, it was 25% of young people that declared that they took part in a street protest. And this is, some people call it millennials activism. The thing is that I'm looking at, or I'm particularly interested, is how these protests intersect with each other, and do we see a process of radicalization? Because, as I said, the NGOs being defunded, and the NGOs being usually the moderate flank of social movements, or broadly speaking, social movements, one might expect a process of radicalization, and for that I use the concept of radical flank effects. And depending on the topic, you see less or more, but radicalization in terms of claims, but in terms also of repertoires of action. These defenses of churches in 2020 didn't come out of the blue, because there were actually protests staged inside churches. That was the first time actually it happened in Polish history since, I don't know, 18th or 19th century. That was something new. And also when I looked at trajectories of what happened to the NGOs that were dealing with migrants and refugees, they also became radicalized, and they also, for instance, their members appear or show up to this Warsaw Anti-Fascist Street party. And this brings me or us to the question: how does illiberal democracy speed up this process or influence this process? Because illiberal democracy, I mean, the term coined by Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, which he actually uses it and he's proud of, it's a retreat from liberal democracy. And it's present in many Central Eastern European countries, not only, but because you can also call Jair Bolsonaro an illiberal democrat, or I guess also Donald Trump. But some of the consequences of this retreat from liberal democracy are interesting, because the civil society sphere in liberal democracy plays quite an important role. When you retreat from this model, there is a gap. And this gap is filled, on one hand, by state-sanctioned NGOs, mostly of conservative provenance, but also by grassroots groups, but are becoming more and more radical. And also the narrative and the rhetorics of illiberal Democrats plays an important role here, as they often attack progressive parts of the society. They also attack LGBT plus rights, also often attack refugees and migrants. So, but in return, you have actually more activism, more progressive activism than you used to have. And this also, I can skip that. This also affects anti-fascist movement, because in the 90s, when you had these groups, it was framed as subcultural clashes. You have punks clashing with the skinheads, and I think that was not only a Polish phenomenon. But now, anti-fascism became something that is more and more trendy. It's not anymore enclosed in this subcultural ghetto. So we have way more Antifa groups. In Poland, we have at least 3 mixed martial arts tournaments that are openly anti-fascist per year. So, and this is getting more and more popular. But also, and this comes from the surveys that I already went through from the Warsaw's anti-fascist process. One of the questions in that survey was, why did you come here? And many of the responses were because the state is violating women's rights, because the state is unfair to refugees, because of labor conditions. These are actually surprising motivations for anti-fascist process, at least in the Polish context. They're totally different than they were in the 90s, because actually people who mentioned the fascist threat were in the minority on an anti-fascist demonstration. What's also interesting is there are new anti-fascist groups. There are groups of 50 plus anti-fascists, quite radical actually. that also shows that it's not only a thing of the young people, and this is not like a continuation. These are groups set up by people that were active maybe in the 80s, but they stopped being social activists. And there's something that is really interesting, is called, what I called it, the rise of liberal anti-fascism. Anti-fascism is used now as a narrative to combat the state or the authorities, the right-wing authorities. And it's used by people that I would never associate with anti-fascism in the past. But the mayor of Gdansk, who was killed in 2019, early 2019, he organized anti-fascist demonstration where they handed out Polish and European Union flags. Most of the anti-fascist activists actually ignored that protest, but still, I think it's interesting that the label anti-fascism was used to organize that demonstration. And its long-term effects for the anti-fascist movement is anti-fascism became part of the mainstream discourse. And actually, this picture you have is from one of the magazines who showed how you should prepare for a street demonstration, like cover your hair, cover your face, wear comfortable shoes so you can run quicker, etc. And actually, one of the tabloids in Poland reprinted an anti-fascist leaflet from the 90s, saying how you should react with the police and how you should react with the far right. And I was talking to my respondents, long-time activists, who said, like, we were really surprised, but because we wrote it in the 90s, and then you go to the shop and you see this tabloid, the Yellow Pages newspaper, and you read exactly what we wrote in the 90s, how to run away, how to deal with tear gas, etc., etc. And actually, anti-fascism is now quite trendy because you can buy T-shirts easily with 3 arrows, etc., etc. It's a symbol that actually was forgotten in Poland since World War II. So coming up to the end, I think what is really important in this illiberal democracy context is that it is who is labeled as the fascist. And in Polish case, and also to some extent in the Hungarian case with less vibrant anti-fascism movement, but also in the Czech and Slovak cases, it is often the state that is labeled as the fascist. So it is not about, it's not a struggle against another political group. It's a struggle about the whole state structure and state authorities, bringing this anti-statist edge to anti-fascist struggles. This also means that anti-fascism becomes a common ground for anti-state politics. That's why I think we have this rise of liberal anti-fascism, because it's a tool that you can easily use to attack the authorities, being the opposition. But also with the presence of anti-fascist groups and activists in these broader coalitions resulting from the growing intersectionality, I think this is what radicalizes these groups. Radicalizes the pro-refugee, pro-migrant groups, radicalize also the feminist movement that is on the rise since 2016 and then to 2020. Because in their program that they drafted in 2021, also combating fascism, state fascism, is one of the points. The same has happened with the Left Party, that also, for the first time actually, put anti-fascism in their political program. So that will be all. Thank you very much.
So we have some time just before the second panel, so we're going to lift up the screen, and I invite the panelists to join me up on the stage for a brief conversation with the audience. I think this was probably the most historically informed of the panels for the conference. So, Janine, we lift the screen. Can we get the screen lifted? Oh, it's from here. It's from on the stage. Hold on. while we're waiting for this technical difficulty to be resolved, let me just say, I don't know about you, but I, for one, will sleep better tonight knowing that the fascists are going to eliminate cannibalism in the rest of the world. But it was nice to end with a more optimistic presentation. But all four presenters gave us this idea of the persistence of history, even though we're supposed to be concentrating on contemporary events. So as a historian, I was glad to see that. Yeah, so who, if anybody wants to ask a question of our panelists, the microphone is there, and they will use this podium to respond.
We need you to come to the mic because this is being recorded, and your question will not be recorded. Come to the mic.
Hi there. So I've got a quick question for Ali. I really enjoyed the talk. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the dynamics. I was kind of thinking it sounded a bit like the sort of, I guess there was a sort of moral economy of anti-fascism in terms of anti-fascist violence. And I was just wondering if you could say a little more about the kind of terms on which that moral economy was imagined, and also how it worked with in terms of state prosecutors giving. I was intrigued that because in a British context they wouldn't give they wouldn't care whether there was a kind of political context in terms of a kind of attack like that. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, and whether in the past that sort of broader political content of anti-fascist violence had been taken into account.
Ali, come on, join us. Yeah, you're already here.
Very fancy. All right. So that's about 17 questions in one. Where to start? So when Nils and I, this is part of a bigger paper that we're writing, and one of the comparison points that we used was the case of the Göttingen Antifa M group, who were really, really, really active throughout the 1990s. And they had tons of demonstrations, tons of events. If you think of an Antifa with the classic motorcycle helmet and the like black outfit, the super fetishistic, you want to buy this in a catalog one, that's Antifa M. And so they did tons of demonstrations and tons of events, but the most they ever got in terms of prosecution was that they had to pay a fine to a Holocaust memorial. And what we argue, the difference between those two movements is that they were presenting themselves explicitly political and explicitly within this trajectory and for political means. Whereas the Antifa Ost group, despite, Christine talked about so many venues for communication throughout East Germany and West Germany, but from what we can find, Antifa Ost didn't engage in any of them. And so the point we're trying to make is that political counterpublic is the reason for the difference in prosecution. That is the reason why Antifa M paid, I think, 2,000 Deutschmarks fine, and Linie A is facing life in prison, despite not actually being there at any of the alleged attacks, according to witnesses. No one's ever heard of her. She probably wasn't involved. But this is the difference in prosecution between 129 and 129A, where oddly, it's better to be a terrorist than a criminal. Does that answer enough of your question that others can have a turn? Cheers, thanks.
Yeah, first, thank you. It was brilliant and very, very historically informed, and I really appreciate everything you said. The one small question I have, or not small, but in this extra-parliamentary opposition in West Germany in the 60s, up through the Red Army faction, the critique was bourgeois democracy in West Germany as being a particularly authoritarian form of political culture, far more so than in France and in Italy, and probably a precursor to liberal democracy today. So what happened between that movement and opposition movements, like you talked about countercultural communities as alternative public sphere, but I remember with the Socialist Bureau and the proletarian public sphere of Oscar Necht and Alexander Kluge, there was a political notion of forming an alternative, and Antifa activity reflected that. And even the RAF's assaults were on representatives of state, finance, industry with Nazi past, not street violence. So what changed between the 70s and the late 80s that kind of reflects this more apolitical, if I understood it correctly, anti-fascism today? And thank you. And
To
that's
whom?
anybody.
To whom is your question?
So one and all, right.
Do you want to go? So, no?
So you can start, yeah.
That's not fair. So the question is, what changed between the 68ers and the 70s in terms of the APO and the 80s and the 90s? 68 failed? Nils, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest change, this is what I mentioned, is the turning point of the 90s, or the beginning of the 90s, the end of the Cold War. I think this is the most crucial point here, what I was talking about. So regarding anti-fascist politics, so we had some kind of paradigm, anti-fascist paradigm, which consisted until the end of the 80s, and then it imploded or exploded. I don't know. But the thing is, all these ideas of anti-fascism were grounded in the history of the real fascism in Germany, national socialist rule, and then we had after 1990 we had debates, especially in Germany, about the end of the post-war time, and I think this is the most crucial point for the changing of anti-fascist discussions and also about anti-fascist politics. So there is, of course, a longer tradition of anti-fascist politics in Germany too, in Western Germany, to be more precisely, so we had anti-fascist groups, especially from communist organizations, who were engaged in fighting real fascists in the 70s, and we had the autonomists, very small groups in the 80s, who fought other very small groups of neo-Nazis in the 80s in a very militant manner. And the biggest change was that with the 90s, it became a defensive. This anti-fascist politics in Germany became a defensive turn, and it grew it became a movement at the same time. And this is what I wanted to say with this cultural institutionalization and pop culturalization. I don't know if this is the right term in English. So we in Germany we have the we always have the possibility to build very, very long words, and so we can say Popkulturalisierung. No one says that in English, so it's I try to try to find a way out of this problem. But these are specific changes in the 90s. So I would say for talking about anti-fascist politics in Western Germany, the 70s are important. The 80s, then we had some kind of change in the 80s, but the most crucial turning point is from the 80s from the post-war time of from the end of the 60s until the 80s, and then into the post-war time of the 90s. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
I was very interested in the initial presentation. The statement was made that it was very hard to define what Antifa was, and of course, if you're going to be a political program, that creates a problem. But so I was interested in knowing, with respect to fascist movements, they have political parties and they form and they seem to take part, but it doesn't seem as though in any of these situations in Germany or in Poland, any kind of programmatic movement that formed with a political program and an actual set of policies developed, and whether you think that sort of has inhibited the popularity of Antifa.
Yeah, just to say that where I mentioned that the left party, one of the left parties, introduced anti-fascism as a political program. I was actually surprised. It was a surprise to all the observers, because one thing I didn't mention is that until late 1980s, anti-fascism was a kind of a state doctrine, winning the World War II against Nazis, etc. But after 1989, it's switched, and Poland became presented, for instance, in the parliament, as a victim to two totalitarianisms, the Nazi and the communist. So it actually excluded the possibility of state-sanctioned anti-fascism narrative because it would side with the Soviet Union, being, which Poland assumingly was a victim to. So that's why it was surprising that anti-fascism actually made it to the political program, although I think it was a very pragmatic move when the leaders of the left party saw how popular anti-fascism becomes in the last years.
We have time for one last comment or question. Yes.
Hi. Several of you mentioned this move from the subculture of Antifa within punk music and other music scenes to a pop culture of Antifa. And I was just wondering if you could speak to, is there still a subcultural scene, and is it different from this pop culture scene that you've seen?
I can quickly say about Poland, punk is mostly dead. Squatting, in Poland at least, squatting is actually dead. I think the symbolic end of squatting era was when squatters from one squat attacked another squat and squatted it. What is actually on was quite big thing for a couple of years was the kind of techno scene, like radical techno scene. But now it is more about sports. The anti-fascist gyms, etc. They're present in most of them of big cities. But I don't see anymore a dominant subculture that would incorporate anti-fascism, at least in Poland.
I think in Germany we have a slightly different story. I mean, of course, they're super connected. But in Germany, you still do have this pop culture Antifa. Like, you can order your politically resistant rubber boots in a catalog on the internet. They're 85 euros if you're interested. But despite this sort of branding of Antifa, where everything is Antifa, you still have the street politics. You still have people who attend. There's smaller demos, but you still do have people who engage to try to protect people of color, migrants, or vulnerable persons. But more so than that, a lot of what Nils was talking about was so many of these Antifa have grown up. And most of the Antifa that I interviewed who were active in the 80s and the 90s are now engaged with refugee migrant support groups, whether they sign up to be the legal guardians of Syrian refugees so that they can enter the education system, or whether they're engaged in teaching programs so that refugees and migrants can come and learn German in an atmosphere that's not explicitly racist. So there is still activism. It's become not mainstream, but perhaps a bit more grown up and integrated in this social institutionalization, not government, but social. So that still does exist. But yeah, there's still street politics. The saddest thing now is when you see neo-Nazis listening to punk rock in their protests, and they put on Tonsteine Scherben, squatting anthems, and then they march to it, and it breaks my heart. Breaks my heart. Yeah. Cheers.
Final word from any one of our panelists? You want to, no? Oh, one last question.
I'll be quick. You mentioned sports. When I was in Hamburg a few years ago, there was something called the Sao Paulo Stadium and League. It was an anti-fascist, anti-racist, and it looked from my perspective, it was young people. I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit and tell us about it.
I mean, St. Pauli is known worldwide as being an anti-fascist football league. There's a couple of fantastic books One is Pirates, Punks, and Politics, which is all about anti-fascist football, and there's a couple of others. We're doing a special edition right now, Grzegorz, Nils, and I, and one of our papers in that special edition is about anti-fascist football. So as soon as that comes out, I think you should take a look, because it addresses this exactly. But no, St. Pauli is not only a sport expression of these politics, it's also one of the ways in which they become very popular and mainstream. So you can get your St. Pauli merchandise online. They're the ones with the radical Gummistiefel, the rubber boots, which I so want. So it's this crossover. It's this, my best friend's daughter is 5 years old, and she wants to play for St. Pauli football. And that gives me hope.
I would like to play for St. Pauli football too.
They have a toddlers team.
Full, believe me.
Anyway, please join me in thanking our panelists for kicking off the conference. The second panel will start in about 5 or 6 minutes. Thank you. Thank you all.